For decades, Gladys Knight, the Empress of Soul, has been the heartbeat of America's spirit, the living echo of faith, pain, and grace that carried generations through their darkest nights. Her voice, born in the church pews, shaped by soul, and polished through years of love and struggle, has drifted across time like smoke and velvet, wounded yet eternal, finding joy and sorrow in every note. She once made millions weep beneath the glow of the stage lights, her midnight train to Georgia turning heartache into a national prayer, her hymns of survival transforming grief into something sacred. Yet behind that unshakable poise and timeless smile lies the hardest battle of all, the battle against time itself. In her later years, she stands not as a fading star, but as a warrior of endurance, facing illness, exhaustion, and the quiet fear that one day the music might stop. Don't look away, for what she sings now may be the most fragile prayer of her life. And if her voice has ever carried you through your own storms, leave a like below, a gentle tribute to the woman who turned pain into melody and sorrow into strength. Every legend is born not only from triumph, but from a wound too deep to name. The woman who once filled arenas with thunderous ovations and would be crowned for eternity as the Empress of Soul began her journey far from the spotlight's glow. Gladys Maria Knight was born on May 28, 1944, in Atlanta, Georgia, into a world where faith was stronger than fortune, and love was the only wealth her family could afford. Her father, Merrill Woodlow Knight Sr., a postal clerk who carried dignity like a badge through long, weary days, and her mother, Sarah Elizabeth Woods, who ruled their small home with quiet faith and steadfast grace, taught their children to survive with discipline and prayer. In that modest house, laughter and music coexisted with struggle. Gladys grew beside her sister Brenda and brother Merrill Bubba Knight Jr., who would one day share the stage that defined their name. Yet beneath the warmth of family bonds lived a constant ache. The fear of running out of money, the weight of racial barriers that shadowed every opportunity, the silent understanding that dreams came harder for Black families in the South. Still, there was love, and that love was everything, until the night it broke. When her younger brother David, Billy Knight, was taken by death's merciless hand, the world inside their home shattered. The dinner table, once filled with chatter, became an altar of silence. Every creak in the floor, every glance at an empty chair, reminded them of what was gone. For the young Gladys, grief was not an emotion. It was air, heavy and endless. She carried it quietly, afraid even to cry too loud, afraid it might hurt her mother more. That silence became her first teacher, and she would later say that every note she ever sang came from the echo of that emptiness. It was not just the loss of a brother, it was the death of innocence. That wound, buried deep in the tender heart of a little girl, never truly healed. It became the invisible scar that shaped her voice, the ache behind her power, the reason she could make millions feel something sacred when she sang. In that hollow of grief, music came not as a dream, but as a refuge. The church became her sanctuary. She was small, almost fragile, when she stood before the congregation, but when she opened her mouth, the room transformed. Her voice, trembling, aching, rising, carried both pain and heaven in equal measure. The worshippers would whisper, "That child sings like she's seen sorrow." And they were right. She wasn't singing to be heard. She was singing to survive. Years later, she would recall, "Whenever life hurt too much, I sang. It was the only way I could breathe." On July 1st, 1952, at just 8 years old, Gladys stood before America on Ted Mack's original amateur hour. The applause that night was thunderous, a roar that promised deliverance. But even triumph carries its price. With fame came expectation, and with expectation came burden. That victory, which should have been pure joy, became a duty she could not escape. Her family's hopes now rested on her small shoulders. Behind closed doors, she practiced until her throat burned, her mother reminding her that talent was God's gift. But discipline was how you honored it. Childhood slipped away quietly, replaced by rehearsals, travel, and the constant pressure to be perfect. She would later look back on those years with a bittersweet ache, remembering the thrill of applause, but also the exhaustion that never left her. She learned early that success and sacrifice are twins, that behind every standing ovation there is a cost only the heart can count. The tension between her youth and her destiny shaped her like fire shapes steel. Out of heartbreak, she forged endurance. Out of silence, she built a song. Every note became a rebellion against despair. Every performance a prayer that pain might one day mean something beautiful. Though the world would one day celebrate her as the Empress of Soul, the truth is, her reign began long before the crown. It began in that small Atlanta house, where love and loss collided, where a child learned that survival is an art and faith, a kind of wealth. It began in the trembling voice of a little girl who sang through tears and turned tragedy into testimony. That was where the legend was born, not on stage, but in sorrow. A voice rising from grief to grace, destined to carry the weight of generations and prove again and again that even from brokenness, something eternal can sing. From the ashes of childhood grief, Gladys Knight's first steps into music were not born in studios or stardom, but in the most ordinary of places. A small family living room on Bubba's 10th birthday in the mid-1950s. The air was warm with laughter until the record player sputtered and died, silencing the joy. For most families, the moment would have passed. But for the Knights, silence had always been unbearable. Gladys, barely a teenager, still carrying the quiet ache of her lost brother, looked at her siblings and cousins and simply began to sing. Her sister Brenda, her brother Bubba, and their cousins Eleanor and William Guest joined in. Their young voices weaving together like fragile threads, repairing something broken inside them. That impromptu harmony stunned the room into stillness before erupting into applause. What began as an attempt to save a birthday party became the moment destiny chose them. Within that laughter layered over grief, a new heartbeat was born. Not just a pastime, but a lifeline. Gladys later remembered that night as the first time the music felt like medicine. Inspired by their cousin James Pip Woods, they took his nickname and called themselves the Pips, never realizing that this small act of innocence would echo across the world. But the road ahead offered no mercy. By 1957, just 13 years old, Gladys signed her first contract with Brunswick Records. She was still a child, soft-spoken, tender, but already burdened with an adult's dreams. The industry welcomed them with handshakes that hid sharp teeth. Their first singles failed to chart, and every silence on the radio felt like rejection made public. For Gladys, still mourning Billy, it was another wound, another reminder that joy could vanish without warning. Years later, she confessed, "I was just a little girl, but I felt like the world was waiting for me not to fail." Still, she would not break. Each night, the Pips rehearsed until their throats were raw and their feet ached. their voices cracking under exhaustion. When the music business shut its doors, they rehearsed in kitchens, church basements, and even cars parked under flickering streetlights. It wasn't fame they chased, it was survival. The fear of being forgotten, of watching their dreams dissolve before they had even bloomed, haunted them through every note. But endurance became their inheritance. Their persistence finally bore fruit in 1961 with Every Beat of My Heart, written by Johnny Otis. Released locally through Huntum Records and distributed by VJ, the song began to rise on the charts. But what should have been triumph turned into betrayal. Others profited from their work, leaving the group with almost nothing. Gladys called it the first time I learned the cost of innocence. The betrayal scarred her deeply, but it also taught her something she would never forget. Talent without wisdom is prey. Soon after, Bobby Robinson of Fury Records rushed them to re-record the track. That version soared to number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100, vindicating her at just 17. But every victory came with its shadow. In 1959, before that breakthrough, Brenda Knight and Eleanor Guest had already stepped away to start families, leaving Gladys trembling with the fear that the dream might collapse, just as it began. The emptiness felt familiar. Not the death of a person this time, but of togetherness. With Bubba as her anchor and new members Edward Patton and Langston George joining the fold, the Pips endured. Yet the wounds of instability ran deep. Each performance carried an unspoken question. Would this be the last time they sang together? There were nights when her voice nearly gave out, when fatigue blurred the edges of sound, but Gladys kept singing. "I couldn't stop," she would say years later. Singing was the only thing that still made sense. These were not the glamorous beginnings of a superstar. They were fragile, hungry, determined steps taken by a young girl and her family, fighting to keep their dreams alive. Each note cost them something: sleep, comfort, safety. But it also gave them strength. In those years, Gladys began to understand that wealth was not in money, but in endurance, and that the greatest inheritance one could leave the world was not fame, but faith. Every legend is born not only from triumph, but from a wound too deep to name. And for Gladys Knight, that wound became her power, the invisible current beneath her voice, pushing her toward a destiny that would soon call her to Motown, where love and betrayal would once again collide, testing how much pain a heart could carry and still sing. The climb to greatness was never lined with roses, and for Gladys Knight, the road to becoming the Empress of Soul was carved not only in triumph, but in scars that time could never erase. By 1966, at just 22, Gladys had already lived a lifetime's worth of struggle. So when Gladys Knight and the Pips finally signed with Motown Records, it felt like redemption. The dream that had carried them through hunger and heartbreak finally seemed within reach. The promise glittered. The name Motown itself was a crown. But beneath that crown, the thorns cut deep. They were branded as second tier, tucked in the shadows while Diana Ross and the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, and the Temptations basked in glory. Their harmonies, raw, perfect, unbreakable, were treated like echoes in someone else's spotlight. Songs that should have soared were quietly shelved. Promotion was meager. Paychecks were painfully small. The group earning less than $500 a week to split 4 ways, barely enough to survive. For Gladys, who had already buried her innocence in sorrow, it was another trial. How much dignity could she hold while the world refused to see her? She would later recall, her voice trembling between memory and pride. We poured our hearts into every song, and still, the room stayed dark. Yet she refused to let humiliation dull her purpose. Night after night, the Pips rehearsed, until exhaustion blurred the edges of sound. Their throats raw, their palms stinging from endless claps, to keep rhythm when the music stopped. Gladys wrapped her aching throat in warm towels, whispering prayers between sets. Sometimes, hunger made her dizzy. Sometimes, she fainted mid-song. But when she opened her eyes again, she sang. She told herself that if she could keep singing, someone, somewhere, would hear. Then came the cruelest blow. Invited to open for Diana Ross and the Supremes, Gladys walked on stage with a fire born of all her scars. Her voice that night, thunder wrapped in silk, rose through the crowd like a cry from heaven. The applause shook the walls. For a fleeting moment, she felt seen, but triumph turned to betrayal. The group was abruptly pulled from the tour, not for failure, but for shining too brightly. Gladys would carry that pain for decades. It wasn't the silence that hurt, she said softly years later. It was being told my light was too bright for someone else's comfort. That night became a turning point. It taught her that brilliance, in a world ruled by ego, could be punished like sin. But she refused to dim. With Bubba and the Pips beside her, she turned rejection into fuel, polishing every harmony until it gleamed like armor. In 1973, that defiance finally found its reward. At 29, she took a leap most called reckless, leaving Motown for Buddha Records. Many warned it would end her career. Instead, it set her free. That same year, she released Midnight Train to Georgia. Her voice, half gospel, half confession, bled with longing, faith, and fire. The Pips answered her like angels, steady and sure. The song soared to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, won a Grammy, and shattered the chains of underestimation. The voice Motown once buried became the sound of America's soul. But that victory wasn't luck. It was labor. Every breath in that recording carried the ghosts of the years she'd been told no. Every note was stitched with sacrifice. Long nights on tour buses that broke down in the rain, bills left unpaid, the ache of sleeping in cheap motels between shows. Gladys would later say, "Success doesn't come from what they give you. It comes from what you survive," and survive she did. Within months, Midnight Train to Georgia sold over 1 million copies, bringing in more than $5 million in its first year, the first real fortune she had ever known. For a woman who once earned less than $100 a week singing in borrowed gowns, this wasn't just success. It was justice. The floodgates opened. "I've got to use my imagination," pulsed with determination. "Best thing that ever happened to me," glowed with gratitude, born from pain. And the Curtis Mayfield-produced Claudine soundtrack carried her voice from the stage into cinema. Each song was a testimony, not to luck, but to endurance. By the end of the decade, she and the Pips had earned over 10 gold and platinum records, and Gladys herself had built a fortune that would one day exceed $20 million. Proof that endurance, not privilege, builds empires. Even then, recognition came unevenly. In America, airplay was still a battlefield. Across the Atlantic, however, a different kind of love waited. In 1976, Midnight Train to Georgia climbed again, reaching the UK top 5. British audiences adored her honesty, the way her voice trembled but never broke. For Gladys, it was proof that truth, though delayed, always arrives. By the late 1970s, Gladys Knight and the Pips had transformed rejection into reverence. Once dismissed as second tier, They now stood as Grammy winners, international icons, and living proof that grace can grow from grief. Their catalog became a gospel of survival, written not in ink, but in sweat. And when Gladys stood under the stage lights, clutching her Grammy, her eyes shimmered not with pride, but remembrance of empty stomachs, long nights, and doors once slammed in her face. That golden trophy was more than metal. It was a mirror reflecting every sacrifice, every bruise, every broken promise that had led her there. In that moment, she understood what the years had been whispering all along. Greatness is never granted by the powerful. It is earned inch by inch, built from the rubble of everything that tried to destroy you. And when the lights dimmed that night, she thought not of fame, but of endurance, of how far faith can carry a weary soul. The hunger, the exhaustion, the silence, none of it had vanished. It had simply changed form, becoming rhythm, power, song. And in that rhythm, Gladys Knight found the truth she'd been singing all her life. That pain, when met with grace, doesn't break you. It teaches you how to rise. The curtain fell in 1988, and the world rose to its feet. For over 30 years, Gladys Knight and the Pips had filled arenas, broken barriers, and become the heartbeat of soul. But when the final note faded and the lights dimmed, a silence heavier than applause filled the room. Gladys was 44, too young to stop, too seasoned to start over. The harmony that had always surrounded her was gone, and for the first time in her life, she stood truly alone. The woman who had carried families, nations, and generations through heartbreak now faced her own, the terror of beginning again. It was frightening and exhilarating all at once, she would later recall. After all those years, I didn't know if anyone still wanted to hear just me. The stage that had once felt like home now looked vast and hollow, and yet she stepped into it. With nothing but her voice and faith, she chose courage over comfort. In 1989, barely a year after saying goodbye to the Pips, she returned to the world with License to Kill. Her voice, darker now, deeper, full of history, became the sound of a new Bond era, echoing across continents and into a new generation's hearts. The song stormed the UK charts, breaking into the top 10 across Europe. It wasn't just a comeback, it was a declaration. The world that had doubted her was forced to listen. At 47, she released Good Woman, a fierce, radiant album that soared to #1 on the R&B charts. The single Men burned with defiance, while Superwoman, her collaboration with Dionne Warwick and Patti LaBelle, earned her another Grammy nomination. For the girl once pushed aside at Motown, this was vindication carved in sound. Her voice alone, unembellished, unyielding, stood among giants. But even victory has shadows. The 1990s belonged to youth, to slick R&B boy bands and glittering pop idols. And Gladys, nearing 50, found herself fighting a new battle she had never prepared for. Ageism. "They called me a legacy act," she once said, half laughing, half wincing. Executives told her she was past her prime. Radio stations that had once celebrated her voice now said she didn't fit the demographic. For a woman who had spent her life proving she was enough, this new invisibility was a cruelty deeper than criticism. It was erasure. Many in her position would have faded quietly into nostalgia tours, living off past glories. But not Gladys. In 1994, she roared back with Just for You, a record that went gold and earned yet another Grammy nomination. Relevance, she said in interviews, isn't about age, it's about truth. That truth followed her into the new millennium. In 2000, she released At Last, and it won the Grammy for Best Traditional R&B Vocal Album. It was proof that excellence does not fade, it refines. As her peers slowed, Gladys leaned into her oldest love, gospel. It wasn't strategy, it was survival. Gospel saved my life, she told audiences, tears welling. It reminds me that I'm not singing to impress, I'm singing to heal. Her 2014 album, Where My Heart Belongs, earned her yet another Grammy, not for fame, but for faith. Through that music, she transformed pain into prayer, and her audience, broken in their own ways, felt lifted alongside her. Her solo years also brought moments that defined eras. In 2009, when she sang His Eye is on the Sparrow and the Lord's Prayer at Michael Jackson's funeral, her voice trembled, not from weakness, but reverence. Millions wept, hearing in her song the same ache that had carried her through life. In 2019, at 75, she walked onto the field at the Super Bowl, no longer the chart-topping star, but a living monument to endurance. Before a divided America, her rendition of the national anthem rose like a prayer, steady, timeless, unbroken. It wasn't just a performance, it was a bridge. By the time she received the Kennedy Center Honors in 2022, Gladys Knight had long since silenced every doubt that ever shadowed her. The girl from Atlanta who once sang through hunger and heartbreak had built an empire, not merely of wealth, but of legacy. Her net worth had grown to an estimated $25 million, but the truest riches were never counted in dollars. They were in her voice, the same voice that refused to bow to age, industry, or expectation. From 44 to 80, she never stopped. She did not just survive the test of time, she defined it. When asked in her later years what kept her going, Gladys smiled, eyes glistening with memory. "Because somewhere out there," she said softly, "someone is hurting, and I still have a song left for them." And that is her truest triumph, that in every era, through every wound, the Empress of Soul still sings. The world may have crowned her the Empress of Soul, but no spotlight could ever expose the storms that ripped through Gladys Knight's private life. Storms far more merciless than any battle for fame. Storms that shattered her heart long before the world ever applauded her name. Behind the velvet voice and polished grace was a young girl forced to become a woman far too soon. At just 16, when most girls still clutched diaries and dreamed of dances, Gladys Knight walked down the aisle, not into a fairy tale, but into survival. Pregnant and terrified, she married her high school sweetheart, James "Jimmy" Newman, a local musician from Atlanta. What should have been a fragile promise of love quickly turned into heartbreak. Her first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, a silent, devastating loss that left her grieving before she had even learned what it meant to be a wife or a mother. In later years, she would recall that moment in a whisper. "It felt like the Lord had taken my child and left me hollow." Still, life pressed forward without mercy. In 1962, barely 18, she gave birth to her son, James Newman III. A year later came her daughter, Kenya, two small lights in a world already dimmed by sorrow. On stage, she was rising, her name glowing brighter with every show, her voice a force that audiences couldn't forget. But off stage, her life was quietly collapsing. Jimmy, once full of promise, slipped into the shadows of drug addiction. His absence was not sudden. It came like fog, slow and suffocating, until one day he was simply gone. At 20, while her friends were discovering freedom, Gladys was discovering abandonment, a single mother of two juggling diapers, rehearsals, and unpaid bills. She would finish a concert bathed in applause, then return to a quiet motel room where exhaustion gave way to tears. Her hands that held microphones by night held milk bottles by dawn. Her voice could move mountains, but her heart, bruised and weary, was fighting just to stay steady. She often stepped back from touring, sacrificing golden opportunities so her children wouldn't grow up without a mother's touch. "The applause never tucked them in," she once said softly. The public saw only the gowns, the Grammys, the glory. They never saw the loneliness, the muffled cries behind hotel doors, or the desperate prayers whispered between shows. Though she and Jimmy remained legally bound for over a decade, their marriage had died long before the papers were signed. In 1973, when she finally filed for divorce at 29, it wasn't freedom she felt. It was mourning. Mourning for the years she had lost, the innocence that had been stolen, and the girl she never got to be. A few years later, Jimmy's life ended the way his addiction had always promised it would. Too soon, too tragic. For Gladys, his death was not just the closing of a marriage. It was the burial of her youth. The man who had once held her dreams had become the shadow that haunted them. She never spoke of him in anger, only sorrow. "I loved him," she said once, "but love doesn't always save you." Those years that should have been carefree were spent in survival mode, balancing motherhood, music, and a constant fear that life could crumble again. And yet, even as her heart fractured, her voice only grew stronger. It was as if pain had deepened its color, sharpened its truth. When she sang, audiences heard not perfection, but humanity. The sound of a woman who had walked through fire and learned how to make it sing. Each performance became both confession and resurrection. The stage, once her prison, became her church. Her voice, trembling yet indestructible, carried the ache of lost dreams, the fatigue of sleepless nights, and the faith of a soul still standing. She would later reflect, "I didn't survive because I was strong. I survived because I sang." Out of the ashes of her first great heartbreak, Gladys Knight did more than endure. She reinvented herself. She learned that resilience was not born from comfort, but from chaos. The pain that once threatened to silence her became her greatest instrument. Every note she sang carried the echo of what she'd lost, and the unbreakable proof of what she'd gained. The strength to rise again, alone, unshaken, and unstoppable. For an artist, losing a contract can stall a career. But for a mother, losing a child, even for a moment, is a wound no spotlight, no song, no applause could ever heal. In 1974, at just 30 years old and barely a year removed from the heartbreak of her first divorce, Gladys Knight tried to rebuild her life. She married Barry Hankerson, a rising power in the music world, a man whose ambition mirrored her own. For a time, it seemed as though fate had softened its blows, that perhaps, after decades of pain, life would finally give her peace. 2 years later, in 1976, at the age of 32, she gave birth to her son, Shanga Ali, a child she would later call a light in all my darkness. To the world, she was untouchable, her career soaring into its golden age with the Pips, her voice lifting entire arenas with hymns of strength and survival. But behind the curtain, cracks began to show. Her marriage, promising at first, began to crumble under strain, mistrust, and distance. And just as applause crowned her in public, grief stalked her in private, waiting for the moment to strike. By 1979, only 5 years after she had dared to believe in love again, the union fell apart. Divorce was painful enough, but what followed would drive her to the edge of sanity. A bitter custody battle erupted, dragging her through months of hearings, lawyers, and endless fear. Gladys, who had once faced racism, poverty, and betrayal in the industry, now found herself facing the one trial she was powerless against: the possibility of losing her child. "You can fight for money," she once said, "but when you're fighting for your baby, you're fighting for your soul." The courtroom became another kind of stage, only this time there was no music, no harmony, no mercy. Every question cut deeper than applause could ever soothe. She tried to stay strong, to keep her poise, but inside, she was unraveling. And then came the unthinkable. In the chaos of that same year, Shanga vanished. Her baby, gone without warning, swept into the hands of fate and silence. Gladys's world stopped. She didn't know where he was, whether he was safe, whether he cried for her in the night. Days became sleepless marathons of dread. Every phone call felt like a heartbeat too slow. "I was living," she said, "but it didn't feel like breathing." The agony defied words. It was not pain, but terror. Desperate, she launched a search that consumed her entire life and fortune. She spent over $1 million to find him. Every check written not as currency, but as prayer. Money meant nothing, she later admitted. Every dollar was a scream. Bring him home. Those months nearly destroyed her health. She stopped eating. She fainted often during rehearsals. Her bandmates would sometimes find her praying in dressing rooms, whispering his name between sobs. Yet when the curtain rose, she smiled. She sang. She hid the storm beneath sequins and spotlights, her voice trembling with the truth only she could hear. Each lyric became a lifeline, each note a plea. Bring him back to me. Audiences saw perfection, never knowing that the woman commanding the stage was fighting not for fame, but for sanity. "I would walk off stage," she said, "and collapse." Her faith, once her anchor, now became her only oxygen. She clung to it, not out of peace, but out of sheer will to survive. And then, mercifully, after months of torment, Shanga was found and returned to her arms. The nightmare ended, but it left scars that time would never erase. Gladys had survived racism, heartbreak, and addiction, but this was her darkest hour. The world would later see her resilience and call it grace, but they would never know how much it cost her to keep standing. Years later, she said quietly, "Music saved my life, but my children kept me breathing." She had learned the cruelest truth, that applause could fill an arena, trophies could fill a shelf, but nothing, not even glory, could fill the arms of a mother when her child is gone. Even in her triumph, Gladys carried that wound like a sacred scar, a reminder that love, not fame, is what makes survival worth the fight. And from that wound, she drew the strength that would one day turn her name into legend. Not just the Empress of Soul, but the Empress of Endurance, the woman who turned pain itself into song. Even as her song spoke of love, her own search for it ended, once again, in silence. In 1995, at 51, Gladys Knight stepped into what she believed would finally be her long-deserved peace. She married Les Brown, the world-renowned motivational speaker whose words had lifted millions from despair, a man who preached resilience, faith, and the power of never giving up. To the public, it seemed like a divine pairing. The Empress of Soul, whose voice had carried generations through heartbreak, united with a man whose voice inspired them to rise again. The headlines glowed with hope. Two icons of strength, walking hand in hand, music and words bound together like prayer and faith. But behind the applause, the truth was far less romantic. For Gladys, who had endured betrayal, abandonment, addiction, loss, and the terror of nearly losing her child, less felt like an answered prayer, a companion who might finally understand the cost of endurance. "I thought," she would later say quietly, "that we could heal together." Yet love, ever her most merciless teacher, had other plans. Their marriage, instead of bringing comfort, soon bent under the weight of unspoken pain and mismatched lives. He was a man of fire, ambitious, restless, consumed by his own calling. And she, though still radiant, was weary, craving steadiness after decades of storms. The tenderness they promised each other began to fray, unraveling into tension, long silences, and distance. Within 2 years, the fairy tale had collapsed. In 1997, at 53, Gladys stood once more at the edge of heartbreak. Another dream gone? Another chapter closed? Another scar carved upon a heart that had already known too many? It was the cruelest irony. On stage, she sang of devotion and forgiveness, of love that endures through storms, of promises that never fade. Her voice had become the refuge of millions, convincing them that love was always worth the fight. But when the curtain fell and the lights went dark, she came home to a silence that was louder than applause. The gowns glittered. Her name filled marquees across continents. Yet the spaces that mattered most, the dinner table, the empty bed, the echo of a house too quiet, reminded her that her songs of love were not mirrors, but memorials. "I gave love my whole heart," she told a friend years later. But sometimes love isn't the thing that saves you. It's the thing that teaches you to save yourself. For Gladys, this was not merely another failed marriage. It was the theft of peace she believed she had finally earned. At an age when many women longed for rest and companionship, she found herself instead rebuilding, again, from silence. And yet, as she had done all her life, she refused to let despair consume her. Grief became her raw material, music, her medicine. She turned anguish into anthems, heartache into hymns. Her performances in the late 90s carried a deeper ache, a resonance that seemed to reach beyond the notes. Audiences could feel it, that invisible ache between verses, that trembling pause before a line about love lost and found. She was not just singing anymore. She was surviving out loud. Behind the sequins, beneath the spotlight, Gladys Knight, now in her 50s, was still a woman fighting exhaustion, balancing her health, her children, and a relentless career that demanded everything. "There were nights I could barely stand," she once confessed. "But when I opened my mouth, something greater than me sang." That something greater was the spirit that had carried her since she was 16. A faith not in love, but in endurance. She never allowed bitterness to harden her. When asked later about her marriages, she didn't speak of regret, only of gratitude. "Every heartbreak taught me how to stand taller," she said. "That's what love really is. Not what you gain, but what you survive." And though love had failed her again, the music never did. The stage remained her sanctuary, the only place where her wounds could turn to wonder, where pain could be remade into power. Each performance became both confession and absolution. Her songs no longer belonged to romance, they belonged to resilience. And when she sang, the world understood. Even broken hearts can still sing. And sometimes, that song is the most beautiful sound of all. As if heartbreak were not enough, Gladys Knight soon found herself battling an enemy far more dangerous than any failed marriage: not a man who could walk away, but a hunger that threatened to devour her from the inside out. It was not fame, not love, but addiction. A shadow that slipped quietly into her life and almost took everything she had spent a lifetime building. She wandered into a new kind of stage, the casino floor, the spinning wheels, the glittering lights, the seductive promise of a win. All of it masked the same loneliness she had carried for decades. What began as an innocent distraction, a brief escape from exhaustion and emotional pain, soon revealed its true nature: a trap. The woman who had once commanded sold-out arenas now found herself captive to the cold logic of cards and chips. Every loss cut deeper, not just into her bank account, but into her spirit. The spiral was merciless. There were nights when she sat at the baccarat table until dawn, her eyes hollow, her pulse unsteady, chasing not fortune but a numbness that never came. One infamous night, she lost more than $600,000, a staggering sum that could have destroyed almost anyone. But the real loss was far greater. Piece by piece, the addiction stripped away her dignity, her sleep, her peace. Her once impeccable finances began to fray. She would later admit that, during the worst years, she lost over $2 million to gambling. Money earned from decades of relentless work. Money she had once hoped would build schools, homes, and legacies. It wasn't the money, she recalled later. It was the part of me I lost, trying to fill a hole that luck could never touch. The Empress of Soul, whose voice had lifted millions through their darkest nights, was now enslaved by a game that cared nothing for her music, her legacy, or her pain. Her health began to crack under the strain. Her blood pressure soared, her weight dropped, and insomnia left her disoriented. She would step onto the stage, glittering in sequined gowns, her voice flawless, her smile unwavering. And yet, behind those eyes was exhaustion, regret, and a terror she could not name. "I could sing for 20,000 people," she said years later, "but I couldn't face myself in the mirror." The same hands that held microphones before roaring crowds now trembled as they laid down chips in smoke-filled casinos. The same woman who sang of survival was silently fighting to survive herself. Gambling didn't just take her money, it took her sense of control. She hid it well, but inside, she was collapsing. Every time she promised herself it would be the last bet, she broke that promise. Every morning brought the same regret, the same quiet shame. She called it a sickness of the soul. And then, one morning, after another night of losses she could barely count, she looked at herself and whispered, "Enough." That word became the first note of her recovery. Gladys walked into a Gamblers Anonymous meeting, a small, dimly lit room without applause, cameras, or glamour. For the first time in years, she didn't have to perform. She sat among strangers, her eyes wet, her voice trembling, and said the hardest words she had ever spoken. "My name is Gladys, and I'm addicted." There was no spotlight that day, only silence, the kind that begins healing. What followed was no instant miracle. Week after week, meeting after meeting, she stripped away her shame and rebuilt her life one day at a time. Her strength became her discipline. She learned to live without chasing the next high, to breathe without the lure of risk. Her faith grew stronger, her health slowly returned, and she poured her guilt into her songs. The stage, once a mask, became her medicine. Every lyric turned into a confession, every note a prayer. When she sang, "I've got to use my imagination," audiences heard determination. When she sang, "Best thing that ever happened to me," they heard redemption. Audiences cheered, unaware that every performance was a vow. Never again. Never again would she let chance decide her worth. Never again would she let emptiness own her. She often said, "I had to lose millions to understand that peace doesn't come from luck. It comes from surrender." When she finally broke free, she was scarred but unshaken. She had clawed her way back from the edge of ruin, and in doing so, she became something greater than a legend. She became a lesson. Her story of addiction was not one of glamour, but of redemption. It stood as both a warning and a beacon, that even the brightest souls can fall, but only the bravest can rise again. And yet, just as she reclaimed her life from the grip of addiction, fate prepared a cruelty no mother should ever face. A loss more devastating than money, marriage, or fame. The darkest tragedy of her life was still to come, and it would test her soul in ways even she could never have imagined. It was the one loss her music could not mend. For decades, Gladys Knight had faced heartbreak and survived. Failed marriages, betrayal, addiction, and the quiet loneliness fame could never soothe. But nothing in her long, storm-scarred life could prepare her for the call that shattered her world in 1999. Her firstborn, James Jimmy Newman III, only 36 years old, was gone. His heart had simply stopped beating, and with it, part of hers did too. To millions, Gladys was the Empress of Soul, the living symbol of endurance, the voice that stitched hope into sorrow. But to Jimmy, she was just Mom. He had come into her world in 1962 when she herself was only 18, a young mother still learning to stand while the world expected her to fly. He grew up backstage, watching her transform pain into melody, studying the way her voice could lift strangers even when she was breaking inside. Their bond wasn't perfect, but it was pure, forged in sacrifice, laughter, and the long nights when she would rock him to sleep before stepping into the blinding lights of fame. Losing him wasn't just losing a child, it was losing the last reflection of who she once was. The news hit like lightning, swift, merciless, impossible. For years, she had sung about survival, about light piercing through darkness. But what song could console a mother who would never again hear her son's laugh? What lyric could ease the soundless ache of a home that had lost its heartbeat? Fans across the world played her records to find comfort. Yet in her own house, the silence was suffocating. No melody could mend the emptiness that now echoed through every room. She had always said that music saved her life. It carried her through the terror of young motherhood, through the collapse of her marriages, through addiction that nearly consumed her. But this time, music faltered. She could stand before thousands, her voice flawless and strong, and still feel hollow inside. When the lights dimmed and the applause faded, grief would crawl back beside her, like a shadow that refused to let go. Gladys later said softly, "There are songs you sing for the world, and there are songs you sing just to keep breathing." That year, every song became both. Jimmy had been more than a son. He was her anchor, her mirror, her living proof that love could survive the chaos of fame. In him, she saw her own history. The girl from Atlanta who once dreamed of a microphone, the mother who carried him through poverty, the woman who built an empire from grit and prayer. To lose him was to lose the heartbeat that had guided every choice, every sacrifice. The pain was endless, cruel in its quietness. Nights were the hardest, when the crowd was gone and the stage lights turned cold. Friends came, family gathered, but grief speaks a language only the broken understand. Even surrounded by love, she felt a loneliness that words could not name. She tried to work, to tour, to keep moving, because stopping meant sinking. Her doctors warned her to rest. Exhaustion and heartbreak had begun to take a toll on her health. Her blood pressure spiked. She fainted once before a show, overwhelmed by the ache she refused to show. Yet, somehow, when the spotlight found her, she stood taller. She sang, not because she was healed, but because singing was the only thing that kept her alive. "The body can break," she said, "but the spirit must not." Those who heard her after 1999 felt it instantly. The change in her tone, the trembling depth in every gospel phrase. Her voice, once velvet, now carried the grit of grief. Neither one of us sounded less like heartbreak and more like holy confession. Midnight Train to Georgia became a hymn for all who had ever lost someone they could never get back. Each lyric carried memory, each note carried prayer. Fans wept without knowing why, because even if they didn't know her pain, they could feel it. Jimmy's death was the wound that never closed. No Grammy, no standing ovation, no glittering gown could soften that truth. Fame, once her armor, now felt meaningless. She had earned millions, but none of it could buy one more day, one more hug, one more word. "You learn," she said, "that the richest sound in life isn't applause. It's your child's laughter. And when that's gone, the silence costs everything." But even in devastation, Gladys did what she had done her entire life. She refused to stay down. She learned to carry the grief, to let it live beside her without letting it own her. She began to see her pain as purpose, to sing not just for the living, but for those gone too soon. Her gospel performances after 2000 became something else entirely. Not concerts, but offerings. Every time she sang "His Eye is on the Sparrow," she closed her eyes and whispered, "This one's for you, Jimmy." And perhaps that is what makes her story eternal. The way she turned agony into art, loss into legacy. She could not bring her son back, but through her voice, she gave the world what his memory had left in her: truth, tenderness, and unbreakable faith. Gladys Knight had faced every storm life could summon, and still, she sang. Even as her heart carried the weight of the unthinkable, her soul rose with each note, reminding the world that the human spirit, though shattered, can still shine. And in that light, trembling, beautiful, everlasting, she proved that even when the music cannot heal the pain, it can teach us how to live with it. From the silence of grief, she found her voice again. Not in fame, but in faith. After losing her beloved son Jimmy in 1999, Gladys Knight stood at a crossroads where most hearts would break for good. The silence of his absence was suffocating. Even the music that had carried her through every tragedy now felt hollow. For a time, the Empress of Soul seemed broken beyond repair. Her voice still beautiful, but haunted, like a candle flickering against a storm. Yet even as her spirit trembled, she reached for the one constant that had never failed her: faith. Raised in the Baptist Church, later drawn toward Catholicism, she found her truest refuge in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a path inspired by her children's spiritual journey. For Gladys, this was not conversion, it was coming home. She turned her pain into prayer, her loneliness into devotion, her tears into song. Gospel, she said, isn't just music, it's medicine for the soul. Out of that healing came her greatest act of service: Saints Unified Voices, a gospel choir born not for fame, but for restoration of hearts, of faith, of hope. She led them not as a star, but as a servant. In community centers and small-town churches, their harmonies lifted broken spirits like wings. And in 2005, their debut album earned the Grammy for Best Gospel Choir Album, a moment unlike any she'd ever known. This was not applause for celebrity, but a hymn of redemption, proof that from ashes, something sacred could rise. Faith steadied her soul, but life in grace offered her one more gift: love. Quiet, mature, enduring. In 2001, at 57, Gladys married William McDowell, a man untouched by the glare of show business, grounded and kind. With him, she found what had eluded her through decades of heartbreak: peace. No jealousy, no chaos, only the comfort of two souls who had seen enough storms to understand calm when it came. Together, they built a home not of marble or luxury, but of laughter and legacy. 17 grandchildren, 10 great-grandchildren, and a kitchen that smelled of joy. Around the dinner table, she wasn't the Empress of Soul. She was simply Grandma, telling stories, singing lullabies, reminding her family that love was the only crown worth wearing. For a woman who had buried her child and rebuilt her faith, this was not just contentment. It was resurrection. But even as peace filled her home, her compassion reached outward. In William's hometown of North Carolina, they purchased the long-abandoned Reynolds High School, once a segregated black school left in decay. Gladys refused to let history rot in silence. She restored it, brick by brick, transforming its halls into the Reynolds Community Center, a place of learning, health, and culture for families who needed hope most. "You can't just sing about faith," she once said. "You have to live it." And she did, turning walls once built for exclusion into doors of opportunity. Still, the stage called her, not as escape, but as testimony. In 2009, the world watched her perform "His Eye is on the Sparrow" and "The Lord's Prayer" at Michael Jackson's funeral. Her voice, trembling yet unbroken, carried the collective grief of millions, and the quiet grace of a woman who knew what it meant to lose and still believe. In 2013, she sang for The Butler, a film about dignity, endurance, and silent strength. Stories she understood not as an artist, but as a survivor. The following year, her gospel album, Where My Heart Belongs, earned her another Grammy, solidifying her not just as a soul singer, but as a vessel of spiritual truth. Even as the years gathered, her light refused to dim. In 2019, at 75, she stepped onto the Super Bowl stage to sing the national anthem. The nation was divided, the air thick with protest, but her voice rose above it, strong, warm, commanding unity through melody. She didn't sing for sides, she sang for souls. In that moment, millions saw not a celebrity, but a testament, a woman who had walked through hell and still found a way to sing about heaven. By 2022, as she received the Kennedy Center honors, the world no longer saw her as just an entertainer. She had become a teacher, a matriarch, a healer. Her fortune was no longer measured in gold records or net worth, but in faith, in family, in the power to lift others. Her health, though weathered by time, glowed with the serenity of one who had made peace with her scars. Each note she sang carried everything she had ever endured: the loss of a child, the chains of addiction, the fatigue of fame, the ache of love, and yet every song still soared. "I don't sing to prove I survived," she said once. "I sing to show that grace is real." And that is her greatest legacy. Out of sorrow, she found faith. Out of loneliness, she found love. Out of silence, she found song. Gladys Knight did more than survive her storms. She sanctified them, turning every wound into witness, every heartbreak into hallelujah. Her life, like her music, reminds the world that even when the soul is shattered, it can still rise and still sing. Now at 81, Gladys Knight stands not merely as a living legend, but as a breathing testament to what faith, endurance, and grace can build from ashes. The little girl who once sang through hunger in a small Atlanta home has become a woman whose voice has conquered continents, whose story has healed generations, and whose name is written among the immortals of music. Yet at 81, her light has not dimmed. It has only softened, glowing now with the calm, golden strength of a woman who has survived everything and still chooses grace. Her eyes still shine with the calm of a woman who has walked through fire and emerged with light in her hands. Her laughter, softer now but steady, carries the rhythm of peace that no fame could ever buy. Gladys Knight's net worth today is estimated at around $28 million, a fortune she never flaunts, but one that symbolizes decades of perseverance, heartbreak, and triumph. For a woman who once knew the sharp ache of poverty and the fear of unpaid bills, this wealth is more than material. It's poetic justice. Her empire is built not on extravagance, but on endurance. She owns multiple properties, each echoing a different chapter of her journey. Her main residence, a sprawling $4 million estate in Henderson, Nevada, reflects her balance of luxury and serenity. The house, surrounded by desert blooms and sunrise views over the mountains, features 7 bedrooms, a recording studio, and a private chapel where she prays each morning. Inside, the air smells faintly of white lilies and cedarwood. Her living room walls are lined with platinum records and family portraits, her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, all reminders that legacy, not luxury, is the truest form of wealth. Her vacation home in North Carolina, built near the community center she and her husband founded, is a quiet sanctuary. It sits on a hill overlooking the town she helped revive, a modest but elegant estate valued around $2.5 million, filled with old gospel records and family heirlooms. Gladys has often said that her favorite room is not the grand piano room or the marble kitchen, but the garden where she tends roses under the morning sun. Peace, she says, isn't something you buy, it's something you grow. Her collection of cars speaks to the timeless grace of her era. A 1965 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, restored to perfection, a Mercedes-Benz S-Class for daily use, and a Tesla Model S that her grandchildren convinced her to buy. Each vehicle, like each chapter of her life, carries both elegance and endurance. Her jewelry box tells a similar story. Diamonds from her Grammy nights, a vintage Cartier gifted by Quincy Jones, and a gold cross she wears every day, engraved with the names of her children. Unlike many stars, she never sought opulence to feel complete. She built her wealth quietly, brick by brick, song by song, until it became a fortress of self-respect. Still, beneath the glow of accomplishment, the weight of time is real. Gladys has spoken candidly about the toll of age, the fading sharpness of memory, the days when the past feels nearer than the present. Though she has never been formally diagnosed, close friends mention her gentle struggles with early memory loss, moments when she pauses mid-sentence, searching for a name that once came easily. Yet even these fragile moments are met with grace, not fear. "If I forget a lyric," she once smiled during an interview, "the audience will sing it for me." Her health has been a long and quiet battle. Years ago, she faced a terrifying brush with cancer, one she chose to fight privately. In 2017, she revealed that doctors once suspected she had pancreatic cancer, the same disease that took her dear friend Aretha Franklin. The diagnosis proved mistaken, but the scare left a lasting mark. It reminded her of mortality, of fragility, of gratitude. "It was God's way," she said, "of reminding me that every note I sing is borrowed time." Today, she maintains her strength through a disciplined routine: morning walks, light yoga, prayer, and laughter. Her favorite medicine. Even now, she still performs occasionally, not for money or recognition, but for the communion between her and her audience. Her shows are less concerts than spiritual gatherings. When she steps onto the stage, time folds, her 81-year-old frame carrying the same power that once shook the Apollo and Motown halls. The crowd doesn't just hear her, they feel her. And when she sings Midnight Train to Georgia, there are moments when it seems that even heaven itself listens. Beyond the stage, Gladys has become one of the most generous hearts in American entertainment. Over the years, she has donated millions through the Gladys Knight Foundation, supporting education, youth mentorship, and cancer research. She continues to fund the Reynolds Community Center she helped resurrect, ensuring that children from disadvantaged backgrounds can access scholarships, healthcare, and arts programs. Estimates suggest her total philanthropic contributions exceed $5 million, but she never keeps count. "I don't measure blessings," she said once. "I just try to pass them on." Her family remains her greatest joy. Her daughter Kenya, her sons Shanga and Jimmy, whose memory lives in every prayer she whispers, and a wide circle of grandchildren who call her Grandma G. They are her living legacy, the proof that love, like music, outlasts everything. Around the holidays, her home fills with laughter, gospel, and home-cooked meals. She still insists on making her famous peach cobbler herself, saying it tastes better when stirred with prayer. When asked recently what keeps her going, Gladys smiled and said, "Faith, music, and gratitude. Everything else is just background noise." So as she stands in the twilight of her extraordinary life, her crown shines brighter than ever, not in diamonds or applause, but in peace. The Empress of Soul has nothing left to prove, only love left to give. She is not just a legend of rhythm and blues, she is a monument of resilience, a woman who built empires out of brokenness, who turned pain into purpose, who showed the world that it is never too late to rise again. And to you, dear listener watching this story unfold, if her voice has ever lifted you when life felt heavy, may this moment feel like her quiet gift to you. Her journey reminds us all that even in loss, something beautiful can still rise. If her story touched your heart, leave a like, share her light, and carry her music with you. Because somewhere, in all our hearts, there is still a song waiting to be sung. From all of us who cherish her legacy, may your own life be long, peaceful, and radiant. May your heart stay strong, your health steady, your days abundant with love and laughter, and may you, like Gladys Knight, find your song and never stop singing it.